So, this was something that she was doing. She was very talented, but it was just something she was doing as a hobby. Like, this was her third wedding ever. And, they were paying her, but it was just kind of like, what do I do now? And I was like, oh man, like just the simple agreement would have helped you so much.
Hey, I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and in this episode, I'm talking to Christina Scalera, who owns the contract shop and who wrote the contract that I use with all of my clients. And she's walking us through 5 things that calligraphers and letterers should have in their contracts. This is not something you're going to want to miss because you really should be implementing all of these things. So let's just jump right in and talk to Christina. Christina, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Becca.
It feels like yesterday that you were on, but also a really long time ago. That was like, I think over 2 years ago that you came on.
Definitely over 2 years. Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah. Well, and last time you came on, we were talking about copyrights, which if anybody didn't see that episode, it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. And there's a lot of information in there. So if you're curious about copyrights for artists, go watch it. But this time, I just wanted to have you on and try and get you to spill as much as I can in this short form about contracts, because people are freaking scared of contracts.
Yeah.
Well, and the calligraphy contract that I use was written by you. So, I mean, like, who better to have on to talk about contracts? But, and I think that a lot of my audience will probably recognize you because you wrote the contracts section in the Panic Free Pricing course. But for people who don't know who you are yet, can you give us a little rundown of that before we jump in?
Yeah, for sure. So I founded the Contract Shop, which sells contract templates for creative entrepreneurs and artists, calligraphers, designers. So we base that on both my experience as a failed calligrapher, to be totally honest. But the good news there is that we make sure that we work with you guys. So we've had over 7,000 sales of our templates, and they're really nice and refined by now to address all of the things, all of the craziest situations that you hopefully never have to experience because you get it right from the start using one of our templates. That's our goal. So that's all available at the Contract Shop. And we have lots of obviously legal resources for you guys if you're interested in learning more about contracts or trademarks or whatever it is that you're working on.
Okay, so I feel like there's a lot of information online for freelancers to write, like in general, just general information about freelancers, like make sure your names are on it and make sure the date is on it and like all the general, like generic stuff. But I wanted to get you on here to specifically talk about things that you see calligraphers and letterers running into because you have a specific contract for them. But before, and like, I know you've prepared some things and we'll jump right into them. But before we get there, I have like one contracts question for you.
Sure.
What would you say to somebody who is doing calligraphy or lettering work for clients right now and isn't using a contract? So like either they didn't know that they should be.
Yeah.
So like their ignorance is bliss, or maybe they aren't using one because they feel awkward having to send contracts to their clients and making things feel so formal. What would you say to people who just aren't using one?
Yeah. So 3 things there that come to mind are, first, the relationship needs to matter to you and it needs to be memorialized through some sort of written agreement, even if that's an email back and forth between the two. The relationship is really, first and foremost, the most important thing to me as I'm considering any kind of contract, because we want to just talk about what we expect from the client and when. I know it's really obvious, like, yes, we expect payment, but like, do we expect anything else? Do we expect them to get back to us by a certain date? Are they going to be providing us with any kind of materials for signage or anything that we're lettering? So those are the things that you really need to memorialize in this more formal agreement in a contract. The second thing that you'll always want to consider is whether or not you're having money mindset issues, because I see this a lot with people who don't want to send a contract. Basically, if you don't have something written down as far as what the payment looks like and when that's happening, it can get really tricky to lean on that client to either make the payments on time or to get back to you regarding those payments. Because if they're not in a contract, it's up in the air as to when and what is due for the work that you're providing. So it's really important, if you do like money, to make sure you do have some kind of client agreement in place basically the money and the relationships are always the things you want to consider. So like when people are talking to me about, oh, I'm just working with my sister, or, you know, it's just a friend, like I'll just do a quick one-off thing, I don't need a contract. I ask them, like, if that relationship went south because your working relationship had problems, would you be upset? And they're like, well, yeah, of course. And I'm like, well, that's where you need a contract, because at the end of the day, your contract gets to be your scapegoat because both of you have time to read it, review it, edit it, change it. And then if you both sign it, that's what you're agreeing to mutually. So that was actually the third thing, is if you don't have some kind of client contract, I think it also tells your clients that you don't really care about their interests either. What we're taught from like Law and Order and all these shows is that like one side is always trying to screw the other side over. And that's not the case. It's actually a lot less dramatic, which doesn't make for good TV, but a contract is there to protect both you and your clients. So it's actually a sign of caring and, you know, coming from this real deep place of service that you are willing to put into writing what you'll also be providing for that client and when. And so I think the relationships, the money, and then also coming from this like deep empathetic place where you do care about your clients, all those three things make contracts really important.
Yeah, those are all super helpful points. And I know I said I only had one question, but I have like two follow-up questions.
That's fine.
The first one is, you mentioned like that maybe it's just in writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a formal PDF contract sent over. So are there instances where it would be fine for people to just have an email back and forth that in writing they've agreed to these things? Or do you still recommend that everybody always send like a PDF contract that is physically signed?
I never recommend physical signature because it's a pain in the butt.
Okay, but like
so electronic, yes, but
whatever.
Yeah, so digital signatures are my favorite. We can talk about that if you want to, but I do recommend you have something. And what we'll actually start with as lawyers going back and forth to each other is something called a term sheet, and that's basically because most of the contract, if you actually look at your client contract, not a lot of it's going to change, just kind of the services and the payment dates and the amounts. Those are the things that are going
you've highlighted in yellow in the contract that I bought from you that I just fill in every time. Perfect.
Yes. So those are the things that are going to change from client to client, but like you're always going to be the same. Your company's going to be the same. Your address is usually the same. So every time you send a client contract out, you can save that in your software. I like HelloSign or DocuSign that let you send electronic contracts for free every month. So those are good platforms to lean on. Honeybook is a great one. So if you do have your contract saved there, you're only swapping out that little portion that's changing client to client. And that's what we as lawyers go back and forth, and we'll have that as a term sheet in emails. And those are just a bulleted list. We all love lists. So it's just a bulleted list of what it is that you two are agreeing on in this specific circumstance. So if the payment terms are a little bit different, if you're listing, this is a place where you would list out all of the points or I guess all of the products and services that you're going to be providing for the client in each bullet point. And that's the thing that is just going to change from client to client. The great thing about having it in some kind of software is that you can just swap those portions out and send it just as quickly, if not faster, than you would send this in an email. But yeah, any kind of written agreement, even if it is just an email, which I think has replaced kind of the back of the napkin type agreements, those are still valid and those still can be considered a contract. Also, another point why you want to have a more formal written agreement sent digitally, because if that's all you have are the emails back and forth, if there ever is a dispute, if they ever do sue you in small claims court or something like that, you're going to have to go off of these emails and find, the back and forth that you guys had, instead of this neat one page, or excuse me, not usually one page, but like this neat one place document where you can find the answers to any kind of legal issues that you might have down the road with a client.
So what I'm hearing you say is you can, you're having your back and forth with your client, you're talking about like what they want and whatever, you've provided them the estimate, and then you could just send them like a bulleted list of the things they're agreeing to and have them reply back to that email saying they agree to it, and that can cover you.
Yeah. That won't cover you probably legally speaking, because there's other things that you need to consider. Again, those just kind of static terms that don't really change from client to client. But as far as agreeing on what you and the client expect from each other and what you'll be providing for each other, usually use services, client payment, that's enough to cover that part of the agreement. So if you're looking for a little bit more liability protection, the email probably isn't, unless you're some skilled legal email writer, you're not going to have that. But yeah, for most people, that is going to just memorialize at least what they're agreeing to provide to each other.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And now I forget what my second question was. I said I had 2 follow-up questions. It's gone. Okay, that's fine. I think we should just jump into your 5 points anyway, because
sure.
I mean, we're trying to keep this like fairly short and actionable for people. So I'm not going to like ramble for too long. Okay. So like I said, I wanted to get you on here to talk specifically about like some things that calligraphers and letterers should have in their contracts that aren't just like the standards that would be in everybody's contract. So maybe I'll just let you jump into them and I'll try not to interrupt you too many times.
Feel free to interrupt. Yeah. So definitely making sure that you're very specific about numbers. And if you are like, if you're providing a specific amount of envelopes, or if it's a certain price per envelope, those are really important things to list out. And if you're not sure how many they're going to need, you can just say, to be determined, like quantity to be determined, but it's at this price. So at least the client knows what it is that they're agreeing to. Or if something isn't immediately clear, because a lot of times when you're working with clients, things change and it's not right there in front of you. Maybe they don't know like a guest list, how many people are going to be there and how many, any kind of quantity that they need, or like what their signage is going to look like on the first day that they start working with you. That's totally fine. Those can just be listed as to be determined, but really making sure that the client knows what your hourly rate is for those projects. If it's something like signage or something like lettering on envelopes, making sure they know how much it is per envelope, per style. If you have different styles, that's also important to just make sure that they're aware that there might be different prices. So those are the types of things that you really want to make sure that you're very specific about, even if you don't know the exact quantity of hours or envelopes or something like that, just from the get-go.
I love that point, because I find like normally when you're going back and forth in an email with a client and they're asking for a basic quote for their 50 envelopes or whatever, I find I always feel weird having to say over and over and over again, like, okay, it's $4 per envelope, but if you want this, it's this much more. And if you want this, it's this much more. And if you want this, it's this much more. And I feel weird like listing that out so specifically in my email. So if you're able to say like it's $4 and then in your contract go into all of those things, it kind of like covers you in both places.
Yeah. And it's, if you have like a 1-pager sheet that goes through this, where you have like maybe a table, that would be a good thing to include as well, just so that they know the prices that they're agreeing to. And, obviously you as the calligrapher, you have to provide those prices. You can't just increase the prices mid project with that person, unless again, it's in writing and you have an amendment for that. But typically that's the reason to do that. And then you have the nice part about that is you have it all in one place, so that when you do have people asking, you can refer back to that. You don't have to memorize it either. So it's kind of a nice, like something that you might consider an SOP or a standard operating procedure that you can just refer back to when you are emailing clients, or if you need to include it in the contract like that. I like that. The second thing though is deciding who is going to buy the materials or how the client's going to be invoiced for those. So if you're the one who's providing the envelopes, are you doing it at cost? Are you adding on some sort of surcharge? You don't need to tell the client whether or not you are. You just have to decide on your end as the business owner what it is that you're going to charge client per each, I guess, anything that you're writing on. You have to decide what that is. So if you're buying a mirror for them and you're lettering that mirror, you have to tell them like, this is the cost for those things, or like, this is the estimated cost. And usually the client's providing some of those larger items. And so it's also important to decide how that client is going to receive those back. And, just letting the client know that if it is, like an heirloom mirror or something like that, that they need to provide insurance for that in case it gets, lost or mishandled or broken or whatever could happen at, their event where the signage is displayed. So they can either get the insurance for it because they care about that, or they can forfeit it and it's not your problem. It's their problem because they didn't get insurance. So just really being specific about who is providing the materials in the working arrangement, and then also if you're providing them, how much that is going to be. And if the client's providing them, letting the client know that they need to have some sort of insurance, or you're just not going to accept liability for anything that happens. That's why they need the insurance.
I just want to clarify one thing about, I know you mentioned it, but I want to make sure people heard it, is that if you're providing the envelopes or if you're providing the mirror, that doesn't necessarily, and you're going to tell them how much it's going to cost them, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, if you're buying the envelopes for $2, give it to them for $2. You can give it to them for whatever price you want. All Christina's saying here is that you have to tell them how much it's going to cost them up front. You don't want to say to them in the email, I'll buy the envelopes, and then spring this $500 charge on them later down the line when they were expecting it to be $100. You need to spell out what those costs are going to be.
Yeah. And if you're not sure what those are going to be, you can just talk about that any kind of purchase that you're going to make on the client's behalf, you're going to run it by them in an email and they have to say yes. That could literally be that provision there is, we're going to run this by you. You're going to affirmatively respond in some way. Yes. Yep. Sounds good. Whatever that response looks like. And we will proceed from there in purchasing that. Or even better, you're invoicing the client at least 7 days before you plan to purchase those materials, so that the client can pay within those 7 days. And then you're paid up front for anything that you're buying, and you're not, stuck footing the bill for their envelopes or a mirror or something. So the third thing you want to make sure that you have is some sort of no pause clause or a financial penalty for the client if they just go MIA. And this happens a lot where people are really excited to work with you and they are on top of all of their stuff. And then all of a sudden they're not responding. Maybe they're falling behind on their invoices. Maybe something personal has happened. It doesn't really matter. The point is, you deserve to be paid as a calligrapher. And this is something, again, going back to that scapegoat, the client agreed to this and they agreed to the terms. And if they needed a change, that was available to them at either the start or maybe writing in and making an amendment of some sort, extending the payment plan, something like that. So you need to provide, as a service provider, some sort of provision in the template that talks about how you're not going to pause the work. If the client doesn't get back to you within, 7 days, 10 days, 14 days, whatever that period of time is that you're comfortable with, you're actually going to put their project on hold. And if you still don't hear from them, they're going to have to potentially pay you to get that project restarted. And usually this is not a small amount. Usually this is maybe 10% of what your services overall are going to cost. So, a couple $100 maybe even to get it restarted, just to really incentivize people not to push pause on the project. Because again, even though you might be starting, you don't have that many projects, it's not that big of a deal. We need to consider this in your overall workflow and how you work with clients. Your time is still valuable. That's still another client project that you could have taken on that you said, even if you didn't say no, you still could have said no in that time frame. And that means that you need to be compensated for that time, or the client just needs to respect the time that you have together better.
Yeah, I actually have never really thought about that. Also, the no pause clause just sounds really cute. It sounds like some kind of cutesy thing, but no, I actually really like that. And I'm constantly trying to talk to my students in the panic-free pricing just about valuing their time and understanding that every minute you're talking to your clients and you're working on their project, or you're thinking about starting up their project, or you're having to put their project on hold, is time that you could be spending elsewhere. And whether or not that's even with another client, or it's just time you could have been spending on your business, it's money out of your pocket. So I love that covers you for it.
Yeah. And these are the little nuances that let your client know that you're a real business. This isn't just some hobby that you have, and they will respect you and what you send to them, the invoices you send, they'll pay them much more quickly if you do treat your business like a business. Mm-hmm. So these are the little tiny things that you can do that really make a big difference. So the fourth thing is shipping. We always want to make sure that the client is either insuring their shipment, or that we've provided some sort of insurance and we've put that into our pricing schedule. We need to specify the time. So obviously, with proofs, they need to be getting back to you on a certain amount of, within a certain amount of days, so that that shipment can happen on time with the printers and the just time it takes to ship things, knowing where that shipment's going. So for example, if it's a winter destination and you live in Canada, it might be a good idea to make sure you have an extra week built in for those winter storms and things like that that can slow things down. So we always make sure in our designer and calligrapher templates to have something about shipments to their clients to make sure that they're considering all the possibilities here. The funniest story I have about, it was a calligrapher in Michigan, and she asked me, what do you do if a client, so one of her clients was asking her to declare the lettering that she'd done for that client as something else. Like, I don't remember what it was, but basically it was going to lower the amount of money that that foreign client had to pay in customs, which is illegal. So obviously that Michigan calligrapher was not willing to do that, but that was something that we added to all of our templates after that incident, because she wasn't the only one. I've actually had 2 other stories similar to that, not as bad as that. But if clients ask you to do something illegally as far as shipping and customs goes, that could also be something that you just don't want to be dealing with as a business owner. Again, a really subtle little nuance that you are a professional and considering all the angles here. So your shipments, anything that you talk about in your contract about shipments, shipping time, insurance, the costs, and then obviously like you're not going to participate in anything that you would have known or could have known is illegal activity when it comes to customs. Those are important things to consider.
I feel like people get really overwhelmed with putting shipping stuff in their contracts just because of like the nature of shipping being so unpredictable, especially right now with COVID and everything.
Right.
It's such a nightmare. And so I think just for everybody's specific business and what you are shipping, like everybody's always looking for a quick answer on like, how long should I put in my, how many days should I tell people that it's going to take, and how much should I tell them it's going to cost, and all this stuff. And it's like, go to the post office, go to UPS, go to whatever company you're using and actually get the information from them before you write that stuff in your contract. Because so many people are like, oh, I can guarantee that it'll be there in 10 days. And then you had no idea that UPS actually said 12 and you're going to screw yourself over. So like do a little bit of research and figure out what that shipping situation looks like specific to your business, because it's not the same for everybody's.
Right. Yeah. That's great advice. And definitely important. Do you ever use like online shippers, like GoShippo or stamps.com or something?
Yeah, neither of those, but yes, I used a different one before. Yeah. And it's been a nightmare.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So you think they're better off going in person then?
It depends.
Yeah.
It's like there's no real answer, but I've always found that the best information I've gotten about anything that's going to go in the mail has just come from me going and talking to the company themselves. Like all the time I have people asking me, if I do a fancy decorated envelope, and people will always say, well, will that actually send properly? Like, will the post office take that even though it's so fancy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't ever just put a stamp on something and put it in the mailbox and hope it's going to go. I'm going to go to the post office and make sure that what I'm sending is actually going to arrive, and they're going to put the proper stickers on it, and they're going to ship it in the proper way and all this stuff. Like you don't take chances with that stuff. And I mean, that's not contract wise, but that's just like general shipping advice. But in your contract, like making sure that you actually are putting in the right time frames and the right costs and all of that stuff.
Yeah. And you can always overestimate and then ship faster, or proofs can come back faster and your clients are not going to complain. Mm-hmm. So overestimating in your contract is a really good idea. Mm-hmm. And then also, having some sort of amendment clause so that if you do need to amend things where the shipping times have changed or the prices have changed, you can do that with a client. And our amendments and our templates they talk about doing it via email, because that's the easiest way to just make an amendment that each party agrees to. Is just, hey, we need to change this part of the contract. Do you agree to this? Here's what I'm proposing. Client writes back, yes, just change this one little word. Great, I changed it. Is it all good? Client writes back, yes, perfect. Now your contract is amended. It's that simple. So that's the type of thing where even if you mess up with the shipping, it's always okay to reach out to the client and make an amendment to your contract in that way. I just wouldn't make a habit of it for good client experience, but that's totally fine. The last thing is the general provisions. And this is something that everybody forgets. So the problem is that if you just consider the services and, maybe the IP, the liability, we've talked about some of this today. The problem though, is that it doesn't consider the full agreement. And what I mean by that is you need to have some general provisions in there that just make this a solid legal document that'll hold up in court. And typically the general provisions are things like governing law. And that's just a fancy phrase for where, if you guys have some kind of dispute, where is that going to take place? Typically it's where you as the service provider are located. You might at some point have a client push back and try to make that where they're located. But typically it's where you as the service provider are located. The next one is something called severability. Again, a really fancy legal term, but all it means is that if anything in the agreement is unenforceable, the rest of the agreement is going to hold up. So if there's like one sentence that isn't enforceable, the rest of the agreement doesn't just fall apart. The third one is called a merger clause. And this is my favorite clause of this is such a geeky moment, but it's my favorite clause of any kind of contract, because it says that this is the final agreement between the parties. And of course you can make amendments, but as far as your discussions and your sales call and whatever else was going on with you guys leading up to the client, booking and paying and working with you, this is all memorialized in this document. And the merger clause says as much. So this is the final memorialization of all the discussions that you've had leading up to this.
So if you said your envelope was $4 in your email, but it's actually $4.25 in your contract, then your contract stands, is what you're saying.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. That's a great example of that. I love that. So amendments, obviously we've talked about that a lot. In my template, it just says the parties may amend this agreement only by the parties' written consent via proper notice. Via email. So that just is what we just talked about as far as writing back and forth. You guys both consent to the amendment. It now becomes a part of your contract, even though it lives in your email. Dispute resolution. This is something new that's been introduced into contracts in the last decade or two. And what this just means is that if you guys do have any kind of dispute, it's going to go to some kind of alternative resolution. So some kind of mediation or some kind of basically someone who's going to go between you guys and work this out with you instead of going to a full-on lawsuit. And then finally, we just have titles in there. So obviously the way that you title the different sections and the different provisions of your contract, if that isn't the spirit of what that clause is trying to say, we're going to ignore the title and go with what's in the actual written clause. And that's it. So those are the things that it drives me crazy, because I work with a lot of people and I'm getting married next year. So I'm reading a lot of contracts, and these are the things that I see people leaving out every single time. And it's such an easy fix because these never change. So you just copy, paste, send. It's in every single client service agreement then.
I feel like that's probably the stuff that people who DIY their contracts would be leaving out, because they have no idea that these are even requirements. Like I said at the start, when you look up what to include in your contract, it's normally both your names and the date and your signature and blah, blah, blah. And then now they've got these 5 things that you just told us. But other than that, if you're DIYing it, you're kind of piecemealing things together, and you're for sure going to miss things. And that doesn't mean that your contract won't hold up for the important things you needed it to, but
right.
You might be missing specific things. For example, I'll give you a very tangible example. I used to not have a contract. Or not have a proper contract. And then I bought Christina's, and I'm not even kidding. I think it was within one of the first 3 clients after I bought that contract. There was a clause in it about whether or not the client was allowed to sell or rent out my work afterwards, after I provided it to them. And so I was doing a bunch of wedding signage for her, and one of the signs just said something generic like "Welcome to our wedding," and it didn't say their names, it didn't say the date on it or anything. And when I sent her the contract, there was probably $1,000 worth of wedding signs. And when I sent her the contract, she replied back and said, "I just wanted to make sure with this one clause, because my plan was to rent them out to other brides after." And I was like, oh my God, thank God I had Christina's contract, because I would have never known to include that in my own afterwards. And I said, actually, no, you're not entitled to do that. And if you want to, like, here's my updated price, because it would be a lot more. Right. And she ended up not hiring me, which is like, fine. Obviously it stings for a second, but then I thought to myself, like, it would have sucked way worse to see her making money off of my work later. So, I mean, like, without it sounding like I brought you on here as a sales pitch for your contract, like, I really feel like for most people watching this, if you watched it and at any point felt overwhelmed about like, oh my God, I'm going to try and write my own contract and I'm going to miss something, like, just spend the money and get one, because I've never had to even think twice about what's in it. And I just send it to every contract and it's a no-brainer.
That makes me so happy. Yeah. I like, my why behind the contract shop has to do with a girl who was a wedding photographer. And long story short, it was not her fault, but she took a photo of a dress that was hanging from a sprinkler. The family had hung it from a sprinkler and moved the dress to take a photo. And yep, sure enough, like, this black gunk started coming out and they flooded 4 floors of a hotel. It was like, obviously the wedding's ruined. It's $500,000, $500,000 worth of damage. And at the end of the day, it was like, who's going to pay for this? Because their homeowner's insurance didn't cover flooding 4 floors of a hotel. So, this was something that she was doing. She was very talented, but it was just something she was doing as a hobby. Like, this was her 3rd wedding ever. And, they were paying her, but it was just kind of like, what do I do now? And I was like, oh man, like, just the simple agreement would have helped you so much, because it would have put the liability back on this family instead of her. So just, if you want to sleep better at night, I do think taking care of these things, because you just do it once and you're done. So.
Oh my God.
But I appreciate you saying all that. That's very kind of you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I feel like I could ask you about like a million other horror stories, but where can, if somebody does, I mean, we'll link to everything down below, but where's the easiest place to find you and learn more about contracts and find the calligraphy one and all of that?
Yeah, for sure. So just thecontractshop.com has all the resources that you'll be looking for. Yeah, we have rocksolidcontract.com as well. So that's actually a full contract checklist. So you can go through, if you're concerned about whether or not your contract has everything it needs, you can compare it to that and just see, what you might be missing.
So you're telling people how to write their own contract too.
It doesn't have our language though. So our language is really friendly and easy to read for anybody, not just lawyers.
Yeah. For sure. Actually, I did find that, like, I can read it and understand what I'm telling people, which is important. I feel if you're going to send somebody a contract and they're going to ask you a question about it, you might want to know what it is.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Christina, for coming on for the 2nd time. Again, if anybody hasn't seen the copyrights conversation, go watch that one too, because I feel like all of these things overwhelm people and you break it down in such a way that makes it feel a lot less intimidating. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, we'll talk soon.